Olivia Miracle, and my pronouns are she, her. I want to acknowledge the unceded land where I've spent all of my time working on this project and where I literally reside, owned and observed by the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. It's important to me to spend a moment to think about and focus on what I have done with my time at UBC, to think about how I've gotten to know and how I've worked alongside my local Indigenous communities. I've been approached by my UBC, so University of British Columbia, MSN, Masters of Science in Nursing, leadership professor, and colleague, Dr. Mara McPhee, about the possibility of an inclusion of Indigenous content into the N512 and 520 leadership course, as I was already working on a project about minority stress and Indigenous communities for my SPAR, and the fact that I'm an Indigenous woman, I felt immediately drawn to this call to action. This project is solidly focused on listening to Indigenous leaders and elders discuss Indigenous identity and leadership. Through these conversations, I hope to learn something more about the complexities and perhaps the differences between Western and Indigenous leadership. I think having exposure to leadership through an Indigenous lens, as offered directly and purely by Indigenous leaders and elders, will positively influence our MSN learners, as there is an expectation that UBC MSN learners will lead in some way. With your help, I believe nurses can offer more concise, culturally safe care.
Well, I think to begin, I should try to do this in my language. Okay. Brenda Jungyats at Norawa, Nibagi Adarodan, Kanyagi Haga, Ne Wakoho Choden. So what I just said is, my name, they call me Brenda, or Turtle is my clan, and Mohawk is my nation. What I have been taught is that you have to begin things in a good way. And what I understand as a good way is to share a song. The song I'm going to sing is a rattle song, and it's called Honey O Gots, the What Got Dari. And it's Honey O Gots means come on, let's go, the good path with a good mind. Honey O Gots, the What Dari. Hey, oh, hari, oh. Yo ho ya, kasni gori yo, anahuya heya. Haya ga swadahida, neo hari yo. Yo ho ya, kasni gori yo, anahuya heya. Yahweh, 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 honey, Yahweh, 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 honey, Yahweh, Yahweh. What also been taught, because I am not from this territory, but this is the territory that I've been on for the last 20 years. I have to pay tribute to the people who were here before me. So I respectfully acknowledge that we're on the treaty and traditional territory of the Michisangi. And we offer our gratitude for and the teachings about our earth and our relations. So may we honor those teachings.
Hi there, my name is Donna Green. I'm a proud Ngwehongwe woman of the Iroquois Nation, the band of the Bay of Quinte Mohawks, halfway between Toronto and Ottawa in the beautiful province of Ontario. I've been a retired elementary teacher. I've been retired 6 years. I taught for 36 years. I taught on our territory, Tyendinaga Mohawk territory.
Sego, wat kwanuharado, Danushuni Yungyats, Waganyaktu, Dano Kanyungehaga, the Gayantaneke Tigidorom, Gundege Nidawageno, Gundege Gunugari, Gara Queen, Catherine Brand, Goha Yundajats, Neage Nistoha, Dano Lennox Hill, Goha Rumwayats, Nerage Niha, Waganyatu, Kanyunkehaga, Niwagun Hoju. So my name is Kanushuni. It means she's making a house. My English name is Jan Hill. I'm Turtle Clan from the Mohawk Nation, from the community of Tyendinaga or Gundege, and that's where I live. Catherine Brent was my mother, and Lennox Hill was my father. He was Wolf Clan, and I'm also the Associate Vice Principal, Indigenous Initiatives and Reconciliation at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'm a mother and a grandmother and an auntie and a sister and a clan mother in my longhouse. I think it's really important, especially as Indigenous people and especially in the current climate and the world that we live in that questions our indigeneity, that we position ourselves. So I talk a lot here at the university about the importance of positioning myself so that you know where I'm coming from, what's informing me, and how I have the authority to speak about the things that I speak about. As Indigenous people, usually when we meet new people, the first questions we ask are, who are your people and where are you from?
I think that has something to do with a difference in Indigenous leadership, honestly, right there.
It's been my experience on our reserve that leadership takes many forms. When you said our leader, right away I went to my principals. I've had 3 or 4 different principals. And also, then I thought about, well, maybe she means the chief on the reserve. And the ones that I liked the best had the best interests of the Native people at heart. And what they did for their people and not for monetary gain. And I found that my favorite principal, he was also the funniest. On our territory, I don't know if it's on all territories, but on our territory, we love to laugh and make jokes and make everybody feel comfortable and homey. And this is what he did. And he had excellent problem-solving skills. And even if he didn't have the answers to my questions, he would say, oh, I don't know anything about that. Let me phone so-and-so and let me check with this person. We'll get back to you. And he would. That was also my principal and also our chief. What I really liked was the principal I liked the most. We had 320 kids in our school. He knew everybody's name. He knew who their families were. He knew who had brothers and sisters. And that's the same thing with our chief. He knows everybody's name. He knows whose family is who. He just, I don't know how he does it, but he does. He knows everybody. So that makes it very family oriented. It makes it very warm. It's a great way to, I've never felt threatened by the chief. If I see him anywhere, I'll just call him by his name, and he knows me and he knows where I work and he knows my family and he asks how my kids are. Like, very warm, very comforting, very non-threatening. And that's I think what makes a good leader. Plus, the other thing that our good leaders are onto is food. We love to eat. Whenever we have a meeting, whenever we have, like even our staff meetings, we always had snacks and drinks and stuff and goodies. When we have any kind of big council meeting, whatever, somebody always comes and makes sure there's, donuts and coffee. And, so that's 2 things that make a good leader. They got to have a good sense of humor. They have to provide snacks, and they have to know you. In my teaching experience, when we had to teach, for instance, math, we made pumpkin pies and apple pies, and people had to measure and stir and do it around a table in groups and talk about what they were doing. Like that's how I liked the kids to learn.
Who influenced that? Who brought that to you?
My grandparents. My grandparents lived about 3 kilometers away, my dad's parents. So we'd have to cut through the woods, cut across to the other side of the territory. And my grandmother was always cooking. Always. My grandpa was always cooking, or they were canning, or they were getting ready to cook, or they're cleaning up from cooking. And they always had something interesting to say. Like my grandparents had Mohawk as a first language, so they talked kind of funny. They didn't call me Donna. They called me Donna. You come over here, Donna, and I give you this for you. And so my earliest memories of my grandmother was having homemade bread buns or homemade donuts. My grandpa made the best homemade donuts. So that's how they influenced me. And they had, we added them up one time. My grandmother, just on my dad's side, had 56 grandchildren.
Wow.
She knew all their names.
Right.
She knew when their birthdays were, and she always got them a little something for their birthday every time. So they didn't make you feel like, okay, you have to use your manners. You have to sit up straight. You have to, when you're done eating, put your stuff away. It was so laid back and easy. Like, and you knew that they were old, And if you ate something, of course, you're not going to leave it on the table. You're going to put it in the sink. They don't have time for that. You know what? You used to common sense, and they encourage that.
Yeah.
But it never once occurred to me to talk back. This was your expectation. This was your job. Do it. Otherwise, somebody's going to go without a lunch. There won't be any food on the table. It's like we all had to work like a team.
So you just knew that inherently, though. Nobody told you that. You just knew that if you didn't.
If I don't peel these potatoes, then nobody's going to eat. It's like, common sense stuff.
Yeah.
And if I don't get the clothes off the line, then nobody's going to have clean clothes the next day.
So would you say it's like a matriarch, like a matriarchy?
Yeah. And that was the other thing. My parents always took good care of their parents. Mm-hmm. My dad would go and get them and take them to get their groceries, or he'd go over there and help them cut wood because they still had a wood stove at the time. We just saw them do that for them. And nobody ever said, like, what are you taking care of them for? Like, what's that? That's just what you did. And other people would take care of their parents. Mm-hmm. It was it's just what you did. I guess it's like learn by their example, by their role models. And that's actually how I did a lot of my teaching. I made sure it was fun. Mm-hmm. I never berated someone if they didn't learn it right away, because everybody learns differently. I made sure everybody went home at the end of the day smiling and laughing. And
again, that feels so safe.
It was safe.
Yeah.
And for Indigenous leadership, there's various types of Indigenous leadership, because you have a traditional leadership, and then you have the product of the Indian Act, colonization. Mm. And so there's political leadership, community leadership, hereditary leadership when we're talking Indigenous people. Mm. So you've got AFN, you've got National Métis Association, you have urban Indigenous political organizations, you have community leadership. So the concept of Indigenous leadership, I think, is no matter what camp Indigenous people are in and what they're working within, it's probably, to me, the care and moving the peoples forward in the capacity that they're in. Okay. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's two different camps of leadership for Indigenous people. And one that because of the Indian Act, this is how you're going to run your territories. This is how, right? And then the skills that Indigenous people have learned from non-Indigenous politicians. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to understand the same concepts, trying to use their concepts to move Indigenous people forward. Some might be foreign to them. Some may not follow traditional paths, but that's kind of what I believe our world is in right now. Various camps and various visions of Indigenous leadership.
So how they connect then is having the focal point. The focal point is Indigenous people. But we're all looking at it from different points of views. But
and different models.
Okay.
Right. So you're a very chronological model, and then a traditional model.
Do they talk to each other?
Well, you're living in the same communities, whether it be rural or urban. And if like Tyendinaga, the territory that I'm from, I mean, as long as I can remember, it's mostly been an elected council.
Okay.
And the chief and council that are elected every 2 years have boundaries and rules they got to work within.
Okay.
And they're the ones, because they're voted in, these are the people we hope that can understand and work within a government structure. Okay. The rule is the government says, mm-hmm. Here's your monies. Mm-hmm. And the monies that were, because of trees and because of the Indian Act. And they're the rules that the leadership are given. And you've got have to come to us, the government, if you want to change those rules. But right now, here's your budgets, work within those rules. That's about as far as you go. So the leadership in that situation is the leader, your chief and council that can see the designation of the budgets, and that's what they're working within.
So the ultimate gatekeeper then is like the federal government.
Yeah.
So those are the original and still ongoing rule makers.
Yep. Yep. So don't forget, there's no other people in Canada who are living under that act. Nobody else in Canada lives under those rules. Nobody. This is where you're going to live. This is how you're going to spend your money. This is how, this is what you're going to work within. I don't know, 50 years or so, 50, 60 years. There have been Indigenous leaders who are have taken the government to task. So that's where your land claims come in. That's where your, membership rules come in. That's where, they're really trying to erase what has happened to them since the Indian Act took over their lives. So over the years, that's Indigenous people catching up, and they feel that Indigenous people know where their territories are, and they've always known that, and it's just that basic fight to get those back. And so what it's like to fight government, right? They've got more lawyers. They've got the bigger lawyers. They've got, millions of research teams. They've got it all. So they basically can tie up those kinds of talks and negotiations up in courts forever. Whereas, Indigenous people don't have those, in those communities don't have those resources.
To me, it sounds like Indigenous leadership feels sacred and like an old language. I wonder if the conversation between what exists and, like, of course, is federal government, like how can you understand me and how can I understand you if we are from different paths and we have different goals, we have different needs.
Canadians, for the first time, are actually seeing and now believing what has been happening to Indigenous people since colonization. That's as painful as it is. That's given Indigenous people and kind of helped open up eyes to see, now maybe you can put together the pieces of what has happened to us by now understanding what kind of life we have and still live.
My teaching is that Indigenous leaders are humble servants to the people. I told you in my introduction that I'm a clan mother in the Longhouse. So in that capacity, I am one of the leaders in the Longhouse. But in my job there, I don't make decisions. I facilitate decision-making by facilitating conversations with my clan people. So when issues come up in the Longhouse, it's my job to ensure that everyone knows about the issues and that everyone has an opportunity to have a voice about what action is taken with regard to that issue. As a clan mother, you don't belong to yourself anymore. You belong to the people. So that's what leadership has meant to me. And I've translated that into the work that I do at the university. Even though I'm in a senior leadership position here, I don't make decisions arbitrarily. Everything I do and all the work I do in my portfolio is done through working groups and committees, because what I'm doing here within our university is modeling what I know to work as our governance structure, which is by listening to the voices of the people and bringing all of that information together when I have to make decisions around things. And it's by consensus. It's always by consensus. And it's important to understand that in my understanding, consensus doesn't necessarily mean that we all agree. It means that everyone has had an opportunity to have a voice and that they've been listened to respectfully. And sometimes we have to respectfully agree to disagree, but we move forward in the greater good, in the best interest of the greater good.
And is that with Indigenous communities or folks at the forefront, like with the goals of that community at the forefront of your mind?
In my work at the university, it is as much as it can be. I have some specific working groups that are majority Indigenous representation, like our Indigenous Caucus, which is a subset of our Indigenous Council. And also we have an Elders Advisory Circle. But for most of my other working groups and committees, it's a lot of non-Indigenous people, faculty members, staff members from the university, as well as community members. Who you are, how you live your life, and what you believe, that informs the way that you walk in the world, right? It informs the way I see my work here at the university, and it informs the way I do my work at the university. As a clan mother, one of my jobs is to appoint a chief. Like, it's the women who appoint the male leadership. So, and it's by clan. This is in the Longhouse, because there's also the band council system that's its own thing, right? But within the Longhouse system, it's the women who appoint the leaders. So when my chief steps down or dies or whatever happens and has to be replaced, then I look at the male population of our clan. So any brothers, uncles, we bring together the women of the clan. We look at our male relatives and see who has the qualities that we need to be the chief. So usually, again, they are supposed to be selfless, you know, they put the needs of the people first. Normally we say they should be married, they should have a family, they need to have children so they know how to nurture, but they also need to be protecting, they need to be trustworthy and honest, you know, they need to have the welfare of the people always in the foremost of their mind. Of course, they should know our laws and our culture and our traditions and our ceremonies, and they have to know our great law. And there's a whole raft of things, but it's about who they are as human beings. And it starts with us as their mothers, because we know them from here, from when we carried them in our womb and then in our arms. And we watch them growing up. And you know, from if you've ever spent time around children, you can tell what kind of human being little children are going to be. Like, either there's children who are born, you know, born leaders sometimes, right? Or they're born with compassion, or, you know, they display compassion, or sometimes the opposite. And so we watch them from when they're that little till they reach manhood. They're with us, they're mothers usually. And we're watching, and so we know what kind of human beings they are. And we're their first teachers. So we're teaching them about how to be good humans, teaching them about the language and the culture and the traditions, you know, teaching them about being responsible to the people. And then they go to be with the men and they learn man things. One of the things about the Longhouse is it's very gendered. But the thing is, after we make our decision, we tell the men, this is who we think would be the next good chief. And the men think about that person, and they know him differently, right? Because men know men differently than their mothers do. So they might agree with us and say, yeah, that's the best choice. We agree. We support that. Or they might say, maybe not. He's done this and this and this, right? You know, he might not be the best choice.
Right.
And that's their prerogative, you know, but it has to be a good reason, because it takes a lot of deliberation to do this. So if they say no to somebody and it gets thrown back to us again, then we have to look again and start again, right? But if they agree, then it goes on to the rest of the nation. So there's opportunities in the process for people to speak up and say whether they agree or don't for whatever reason.
In my opinion, an elder are people who hold traditional knowledge of their own culture, who are potentially language speakers, who can carry on traditional ways of knowing, and who can carry out ceremony, and who live their lives according to the responsibilities of the Creator. But a traditional elder is like something totally different from a structure. But I understand the structure part in terms of people who can carry out ceremonies and things like that. But I don't see that as a structure.
Okay.
Ceremonies are part of Thanksgiving. Before all other words are spoken, before all other things happen, we as Haudenosaunee people go through that Thanksgiving address, and that puts everybody on the same playing field. But that Thanksgiving is giving thanks. It's not a prayer because we're not asking for anything. Mm-hmm. It's giving thanks for all of creation. So we're all on the same page, right? So we're all, before negotiations start or whatever, but that means a non-Indigenous structure has to recognize and agree that, yes, before we do anything else, we're all on this same page. And all of this same page is everything that is very simple.
To me, it's two things. You've got your traditional elders who are selected to be clan mothers or just very knowledgeable people. And then elders like my aunties and my uncles and older citizens that live around here. We were brought up that, like, for instance, I had like 6 Aunt Audreys. I had more aunts and uncles than I knew. And it wasn't until I was about 16 or 17 that I figured it out that, oh, they're not really my aunt and uncles, but it's a form of respect. Just like you have Auntie Jan. You do know she's not your real aunt, but she's always been Auntie Jan because that's how you show your love and respect. And, I raised my kids to be that way too. They have aunts and uncles that aren't really their aunts and uncles. And it just makes it more homey and more community oriented. And our secretary at school's kids always called me auntie, and they're not my cousins or my nephews or nieces, but they all call me that, which is, a sign of respect.
In Haudenosaunee culture, we don't have elders. We don't use the term elder. We have chiefs, clan mothers, faith keepers, knowledge keepers, wisdom keepers, but elder is not really a word or a term that we use. But in other instances, like my Anishinaabe contemporaries and colleagues, they would refer to all of those people as elders, except for the thing with us is a lot of our people, Haudenosaunee people, are young. We have a lot of young knowledge keepers. Like a lot of our speakers now are young people, and a lot of them have grown up all their whole lives in the Longhouse. So that's all they know. So even though they're only 25, they've got a wealth of knowledge because it's been the whole life that they've lived. And people wouldn't necessarily call them elders, but they're knowledge keepers.
With regards to where knowledge comes from, it says, is it Indigenous experience or is it academia? I wonder what you might have to say on that.
Well, for me, it's both, surprisingly. I mean, I am deeply embedded in the Longhouse and have been since I was like in my late teens, early 20s. But my first learning came from books when I went to university, because when I grew up on the reserve, my family was very Christian. So I was raised in the church till I was 16. And then I talked to my dad and said, this stuff doesn't do it for me. So when I turned 16, I stopped going to church. But there was a void there because there was no Longhouse in the community then. So there was nowhere to go to learn. And I knew there had to be something else. So then when I was 19, I went to university and I met, I actually that summer after my first year went to Morley, Alberta to an ecumenical gathering. There used to be annual gatherings of spiritual people, Indigenous spiritual people at Morley, Alberta every summer. And like hundreds of, especially young people, but old people, like the elders and knowledge keepers would come and do ceremony, do teachings, have sweat lodge, do all kinds of things. And we went all the way out there and I met Mohawk young people from Akwesasne, which is like 2 hours away from here. I didn't go up to the gatherings at the teepee that we actually went there for. We stayed in our camp, me and all the other Mohawk young people, and they taught me about the Longhouse. They taught me songs, they taught me dances, they taught me about our great law, they taught me about our culture. It was funny because I always say, everything happens for a reason, and you end up wherever you end up for a reason because there's something there for you to learn.
Oh my God.
And so I went all the way to Alberta to meet other Mohawks to learn about being Mohawk.
Well, my former principal, he was so much fun.
I think I have a lot of people in my circle that I would consider leaders in one respect or another. Mm-hmm. And probably the commonalities are that selflessness, like I spoke in the beginning, that we're humble servants of the people. Mm-hmm. And that's what I see in these people that I consider to be leaders. But they also are very grounded in who they are as human beings, mm-hmm. in their culture, in their traditions, some of them in their language, their history. Mm-hmm. Like they're very confident in who they are. They're very grounded, mm-hmm. And can speak to that, but they're not arrogant, right? I mean, yeah, but really in service to the people and in service to the nation and in service to our confederacy and in service to our goals of like self-determination and sovereignty, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about like the change in leadership roles and also a little bit about colonialism. If you sort of spoke about these two worlds, you have the longhouse and then you have like
the band council.
I wonder if there might be a difference in goals between. Yeah, I'm thinking.
I see it now at home because we've got the band council chief, right? And every 2 years, I think they hold an election for a chief and a band council. That's the government recognized governing body of the community.
Right.
So we have a chief and 4 counselors. And what I see now happening is younger people are being voted in as counselors, and they're coming with these different expectations or these different goals, like you're talking about, mm-hmm. like resurgence, like language, like for the first time ever, our band council passed one of their laws anyway. They've made Mohawk our official language. But that's coming, I think, a lot from the younger council members to whom this stuff is now important. Mm-hmm. Whereas to the old guard, it wouldn't have been important because the older people didn't see the value of language because it didn't get you a job. It didn't help you be successful because they'd been assimilated because of all the effects of colonization, because of the residential school, because of the churches, because of all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. The attitude was that it was better to speak English and to get a Western education, mm-hmm. and be successful.
Well, I have to say the very first leader in my life is my mother. And my mother and the women in my life were my leaders because for many reasons, they were sheltered from they were not allowed their traditional culture and language, but that didn't stop them from understanding what they had to do in the community, what they had to do for their kids. When I was in grade 8 and I was still on the reserve school, and we had a superintendent that came to the school and said that your children will not be successful unless they take English. And so the Indigenous women there, like we were only allowed a half hour of Mohawk a week because the superintendent told them that, well, that's not going to get them anywhere. Your children will be unsuccessful, right? Mm-hmm. So the women there just said they had to fight for that half hour of Mohawk because mm-hmm. they knew that they didn't, you are not to be ashamed when you go off the reserve and go to another school. That is not, you be proud of who you are and you do the best of who you are. I think it's my responsibility to be a spokesperson, mm-hmm. as much as I know. I think that's my responsibility. I mean, as Indigenous women, I believe that we've got responsibilities in terms of, you got to help your community, you got to help your family, you got to help, like that's just something that I was raised with. Okay. I mean, it's your responsibilities to right the wrong. Do I go out and protest when I can? Mm-hmm. Do I write, what do you call it, your MPs or whatever? Mm-hmm. On occasion. I do what I can, I guess, in terms of just improving the life. I think it's my responsibility. And so, yes, I do.
It's interesting when you said that it was your responsibility.
Well, in some Indigenous cultures, too, like women are responsible for the water, women are responsible for the caretaking, women are responsible for, like, there's different areas in different Indigenous cultures where there's a specific role for women. In Haudenosaunee culture, the specific role was that they were the ones that chose the leaders, and they were the ones that chose the spokespeople. They were the ones that looked after the home, right? They were, the men's responsibility. They had other responsibilities. So that, but what remained integral in Haudenosaunee traditional societies was that women were seen as the leaders. They were seen as people who were the movers and the shakers.
See, and right from the very beginning, when we teach our children or anybody, you never create voids. When we go hunting, when we go gathering, when we go fishing, you never take without giving back, even if it's our tobacco. We only take what we need, but the teaching is that you don't create voids. You don't take without giving back, and you only take what you need because you have to make sure there's someone there for whoever comes after you, right? Mm-hmm. And when we're picking medicine, we never pick the first one that we see. We always go in a bit and then pick, because that one that you see first might be the leader of that medicine. So you don't pick it first, right? Mm-hmm. But you talk to the medicine, tell it why you're there, who you're picking it for, what purpose it's going to serve. But even when you're picking that medicine, then you give your tobacco back in appreciation, because all of our teachings are about acknowledgement and giving gratitude. That's like the basis of our life, is about acknowledgement and gratitude. Giving thanks for everything that we have, taking only what we need, ensuring there's enough for everybody else. When I started, it came from books. And then I met these other young people and they started teaching me. It was a road. It was a long road. It wasn't until, because there was all kinds of, there were struggles, right? There was conflict between the way I was living my life and the way I felt I should be living my life if I wanted to be authentically Mohawk or authentically Longhouse. I didn't even think about Longhouse at the time, probably just about being authentically Mohawk and what that meant to me, because it was like a clean life, right? It was like drug-free, alcohol-free, living a good life. And I was not those things when I was young, right? I was very much in a party mode. I was my first time away from home. And so there was conflict there about having to consider how I needed to live my life if I wasn't going to be a hypocrite. It came down to whether I was thinking I was being hypocritical by saying I believed in these things, but yet I was living my life this way. But I wasn't ready to absorb them into my life yet, or something. I wasn't ready to make that commitment or something yet. I ended up leaving university. I dropped out. Again, it wasn't really what I wanted. I went to school because my dad wanted me to go to school.
Yeah. Do you feel intimidated? Something I've experienced is there's so much information and it's available from everywhere. Like I turn on I'm going through Instagram in my first half hour of the day. I'm still in bed and still information is just coming in. And I feel the roadblocks are just that, have you read all of these people? Have you listened to all of this music? And there's all this art. And I'm just climbing this hill.
Well, the good thing is when I was your age or when I was younger and doing this, there wasn't all the social media. There was no Instagram or no Twitter and Facebook. None of that existed. So I didn't have that bombardment of information, right? I didn't have to worry about the bombardment of information. I did feel a bit of, what was your word? Intimidation. Yeah. Because I did meet other young Mohawk people or Haudenosaunee people who'd grown up in the Longhouse and knew so much, right? Mm-hmm. Especially those girls from Kahnawake. They were always so confident. It's a hard language. And when
it's so hard.
And when you work in the academy and you're in English all the time, it's hard to then think in Ganyo Geha, and
learning about, the language and the way that it's used and the softness in which I hear it feels delicate there. There's something I want to know. There's something more there. There's some history there.
Well, language will teach you the culture because it'll teach you all about our relationality with each other as human beings, with the rest of the world, because it's all in our language and the way we speak. Because it's like we have these words that are, is one of the words for coffee. But what it really says is, you take the beans, you crush them up, and you pour hot water over them.
Yeah.
But exactly. The word is that means coffee.
And I think also there's something about being submerged in language. Like if you're speaking it around you, then you're hearing those sounds and the delays and all of the nouns and verbs and whatever else so it becomes more familiar. But when you're not, cultural resurgence is kind of the utmost importance right now. Like, not that it ever hasn't been, I guess, but lately, I feel like there's this burst of wanting to push.
Now, you see, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
But our culture on the reserve has always been here. It just hasn't been out in the open, in the newspaper kind of things, but it's always been, I want to say underground, but not really underground, because it's not been that long ago, the whole 60 scoop, the whole residential school things.
Well, that's not happening. The repercussions.
Even your own grandmother. I think I told you the story about your grandma.
Yeah.
Where her mother had a trap door in the kitchen. Whenever the Indian agent comes, she made grandma and her brothers and sisters hide under the floorboards. She really didn't speak English. So when he came to the door and asked her, she knew what he was about, but she wasn't going to let him take her kids away. And then it's not that long ago.
No, I know. And we might not be here. So that's definitely something I've thought about at length, actually.
And my dad's parents, your grandfather Miracle, they moved off the reserve into a little nearby town, and took their kids so their kids wouldn't get taken. It was only the kids that lived on the territory taken. So he just up and moved everybody.
I consider myself a member of the community of Tyendinaga, and I consider myself a member of the Longhouse community. But the Longhouse community is vast because there's the small Longhouse community in Tyendinaga. There's the larger Mohawk community. There's the Nation community. So it's vast, right? It includes all of the 6 nations in 3 provinces and across the border into the United States, right? So 2 countries, like it's vast. But really, that's probably how I identify. Like I'm a Mohawk woman. That's who I am. Everything else can be stripped away. And I will always be that regardless. And because of that, I've learned to live my life in a certain way. I mean, that's led me to live my life in a certain way with certain beliefs and understandings and responsibilities. And for Canadians, it's about rights and freedoms, right? But for Ungwahue, it's about responsibilities.
I like to think that they thought I cared enough to do the best that I could do.
They would remember me as being kind, as being happy, being kind, having a positive attitude with them, and being very helpful. I was always very helpful. I made sure everybody knew what they were doing and that they had the tools to do what they needed to do. This big, rough, tumble guy, he just last week, he said, Mrs. Green, I still have all the books that you gave me. I taught him in grade 3 and then in grade 4 and then again in grade 6. And at the end of the year, I always made sure each kid had a book that I'd write in it and I'd pick it out from it. I'd pay for it myself so that they all had a nice memory of the year. He said, I've got all those books. He said, and I'm reading them to my kids. I said, oh, that's really nice. I see myself more as a coach.
Or like kind of a mentor, maybe.
Yeah, kind of. Not really a mentor because that makes me feel old.
Collaborative, inclusive. With me, when I say my leadership style is inclusive, I mean inclusive of the community who I serve. One of the non-Indigenous professors, who's a very much an ally and champion and a friend, said to me, Jan, somebody needs to write a paper about the way that you lead, because not everybody does their work the way that I do my work, because I very rarely will make a decision without consulting the people.
Indigenous ways of knowing provide you with a different way to hear a story.
Well, again, it depends. It's contextual, right? Yeah. In the Longhouse, I need to know about the ceremonies and the traditions and the culture. The language would put me right up there. I need to know about the Great Law, and I need to know about communities and relationships and protocols and processes. Those are things that I need to know as a clan mother in the Longhouse. As a senior leader at the university, I need to know kind of the same things. I need to know the policies, the protocols about relationships, who I have to go to get business done. I need to know, but I also need to know, what does the community want and how can I help facilitate or fulfill meeting expectations or advancing the work that we all do here. The things I think should be really easy to change end up being the most complicated, and the things that I think are going to be really complicated end up sometimes being the most easy. One of the examples is several years ago now, people were just starting to do land acknowledgements. And so a student from the law program came to me and said, I think that Senate should be doing land acknowledgements. And I said, well, that's a good idea. And he said, so let's put a proposal together and talk about why Senate should be doing land acknowledgements. And I said, okay. I said, I'll just call the Secretariat office and ask about the process. How do we move this forward? Like, where does the proposal go? Do you have a format? Blah, blah, blah. So I called the Secretariat office and I spoke to I said, okay, Lon, I had a student come and this is what he talked to me about. We want to know how we do that. And Lon said, well, we can do that. We didn't have to do anything. All I had to do was ask the question. Sometimes all you got to do is ask the question. Yeah. But then sometimes things are so complicated, it's ridiculous.
Do you feel like you came into those roles? Did you need to know all of those things before you walked into that role? Or was it something that over time you picked up pieces and pieces and pieces? Like, could it be learned over time? Like, does leadership go like this?
It could definitely be learned over time. When I first became the clan mother, I didn't know very much of anything, but I knew more than everybody else. So that was why they asked me to do it, because I was 29, right? I was really too young to be put in that position, but there wasn't anybody else really to be put in the position. Over time, I've learned, right? Because I keep saying I'll stay till someone's more qualified than me, but I become more qualified every year as time goes by. And it's the same with my job, like my job at the university. I didn't know everything, absolutely not coming into this role, but I've learned over time how to operate at this level in the university. And that was a little difficult. Took some mentoring and coaxing and coaching. And I had people who mentored me a lot when I first got into senior leadership that I'm thankful for.
I think enthusiasm plays a big part too. But I should think to be an effective leader, you have to be a good listener. I think that's key, and not be a know-it-all. Okay, I don't know how to do that, but I'll find someone who will help us do it. Find that out and get back to you and just do it.
Leadership is a responsibility, but it's a responsibility to get yourself up to par. A good leader doesn't stay there and say, this is what we're doing, but you figure it out and tell me. Okay, that's not being a leader. Where now you're asking, you just figure it out and just tell us. I mean, a good leader can be coordinated. You have to be a good coordinator, right? But before you start delegating responsibilities to other people, you have to know what all those other pieces, what your end goal is. I worked for a very small Indigenous organization I was an employment counselor. What I didn't understand, I was 23, I think, is I was counseling people who were looking for jobs who were product of residential schools. I was too young to help them in the way that they needed to be helped. All I knew was, well, if you're going to get a job, I have to go and knock on employers' doors, and I have to say, like I wasn't aggressive enough. I didn't have enough lived experience to really make my case. I couldn't help the Indigenous people in Alberta as much as I would have liked to. I mean, I even worked with residential school survivors, but I didn't know that until 3 Indigenous men who were runners to carry the fire for Pan Am Games, I think. Anyways, I worked with a fellow who was one of those runners. Mm-hmm. And they thought they got them from residential school, and they figured, well, we'll get them to run all the way to wherever they were supposed to run, somewhere in Minnesota. And these 3 guys ran every day, and they carried that fire. But when they got to the venue, they weren't allowed in, and they had to pass that fire over to a non-Indigenous person who kind of ran in and got all the accolades and things like that. So anyways, I wasn't really familiar with that story, but these 3 gentlemen brought this film to the university. So we were singing for them. And as the guy was talking, I went, I know that voice. Oh. So it had to have been 30 years since I heard from Billy. Him and I got to talk, and I said, Billy, I lost track of you. Like, where did you go? I mean, anyways, and I just said, Billy, you never ever told me. We were counselors together in this organization years ago, and you never told me. He goes, you know what? After I left that organization, I was on the street for 3 years. He goes, I couldn't tell anybody. To be a respected and effective Indigenous leader, you have to know who you are, where you come from, where you situate yourself. I have a responsibility to do the best that I can. And the way that I can do that is that I have to be a good listener. I have to cause no harm. I have to speak the truth. And I have to do my research if I don't know. I have to be willing to continually to learn. And I keep in mind what your responsibility is in whatever the leadership role you have, mm-hmm. and act in a good way with a good mind.
I don't know if it's true or not, but I always find myself more comfortable around an Indigenous leader than a non-Indigenous leader, because I kind of know that their community is our community, mm-hmm. and that his values and his morals are going to be reflected from what ours are. Okay. If it's a non-Indigenous person, you don't know what their background is or where they came from or who their people are. That's the first thing they ask when you go, now, who's your people? Mm-hmm. That's a big thing on our territory.
I also want to say, Western leadership is very rule-oriented. You are one of seven different leaders, basically. So you fall under these different categories. It's very 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. I wonder then how to learn, or how one would expose learners or students that are learning in this really 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 way about a different way. And I wonder if that might be helpful. For example, you're an Indigenous person and you come into a hospital and you have a nurse, and your nurse has been trained in a certain leadership way.
For instance, if I go to the hospital, mm-hmm. and there are 2 nurses that I can talk to, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, I would talk to the Indigenous one.
So interesting that you say that.
I would think that they would have similar background to me, whether they did or not. They could have grown up in the city for all I know, not know a Native person from a banana peel. So, but then I would, after you talk to them for a bit, you would get it.
I get that. And I totally understand what you're saying. I had said earlier on in my studies, how interesting if we could go into a hospital and we could choose our own nurse, like we do our therapist. I choose my therapist based on 3 different criteria. I will not pick somebody who's not a part of my whatever communities I identify with. It's too bad that we can't go into a hospital and be able to.
Which is interesting, because when my mom had, she broke her hip or her pelvis or something a number of years ago, and she just hates being in the hospital. So she was in the hospital. So I'd spent all my time there with her. And then I come to find out she has a niece, and her really good friend's daughter were actually nurses at that hospital. And they would come in, whether they were assigned to her or not, they would come in and sit with her and talk to her. And so my mom was very comfortable being in the hospital. And now the thing is, if they had asked my mom, do you want an Indigenous nurse? She'd say no. She wouldn't want to bother anybody. Well, don't make someone come and see me. I'm not important. Don't bring anybody to me. So they would just come in on their own.
So that'd be extra work then, in a way. I'm thinking of work as more something else to think about, something else to worry about, somebody else that might have to worry about me, somebody else that might have to check.
Yes. Yeah. Mom didn't, don't bother with me. I'm fine. She's laying there with a broken pelvis. I'm fine. Don't worry about me. You go about your day. But when her niece came in, they would sit and laugh. She would even come in on her lunch and, her breaks and sit with my mom, and they'd talk and laugh and think for her. That's
kind of also food for thought with regards to opening up facilities that are closer to home or that are on reserve, run by family and friends. And so there is that already. You don't even have to there's no extra work. I know you. I know who you are. It's tricky though. Like if, for example, there's only one kids hospital, there's only one kids hospital, and it's like, not anywhere close to.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like there are, unfortunately, or, whatever steps that need to be taken to come closer to finding a connection or filling a gap or kind of moving together.
That's not ideal.
There's tons of ways that you can educate yourself. Every Canadian's responsibility to understand what colonization did to Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Any good leader, any good nurse, any good practitioner, anybody. In order to do your job, you gotta know who you are first. Once you know who you are, once you know where you're from, you do your research, you speak the truth, you respect people, you're willing to listen, especially. You're going to be good in any job that you do. But when you're a teacher, when you're a nurse, when you're a doctor, when you're a lawyer, when you're any of those professions, if you understand there's always another way of looking at things, or there's another way people see things. In order to be successful, in order to work within an Indigenous community or for Indigenous urban organizations, you got to do your homework. You got to understand where those people are coming from. And if that means if you're a nurse and you go in, you got some people sitting there, you ask them what's wrong, but they want to talk about what happened in their community, they need to be heard. Because within those stories, you're going to pick up, so this is what's happening. Your diagnosis can be a little better once you understand where they live and what they're facing.
Again, it depends on what level of leadership you're talking about. Like if we're talking about national politics or provincial politics, and those leaders, I think it's about how decision-making takes place and how people are even put in positions and what their commitments are to those positions that they've been put into and to their constituents or the people they're supposed to be representing, right? And because we've got these party systems, if you get in, are you representing everybody or are you only representing your party? There's that. Whereas
that's key.
Indigenous leadership, I think it's always supposed to be thinking about the 7 generations not yet born, the 7 generations of ancestors who went before us, and how we make sure that the world is a better place for those children coming, and that we are responsible for the wellness and well-being of all of our people, regardless of what party they vote for, right? And it's not even just all Indigenous people. Like we have an elder on staff here, and he does a lot of work with international students. And he's always saying, especially now, we're not only here to think about our people and our children, we have to think about their children. He says, because if you think about the beginning of time when the Creator made us all, the Creator made us all, and the Creator made us all equal. And we are all family because we were all created out of the same clay. We just ended up in different places, right? But if we go back to our original teachings, we're all made out of the same clay. We're all related, and we have to be responsible to each other as human beings.
Does a hierarchy exist?
Not in the Longhouse, I don't think it does.
No.
Although some people might say it does, because there's the chiefs, clan mothers, faith keepers who kind of make decisions, but really they're the workers. They're the ones that put action to the direction given by the people. right? They make it happen. They make ceremonies happen. They make whatever, the meetings happen. But I would say probably the band council would be defined more as a hierarchy. Although I don't know if they would say that or if that's their intent. But it's like there's a chief, there's a council, and then there's all their staff, right?
I've always had a really good interaction with the healthcare system. I've never had a problem with any of them. And I think it's because our where we live on our territory, we're really unique. We're really close to the two neighboring cities. They never treated us any differently. I never felt any kind of, racism or, oh, well, I'll do you later kind of thing. That being said, there's a great shortage of doctors all around here. So my doctor that I had for 50 years retired, and I have a new doctor, and he just became a doctor in 2018. He said something to me, and it wasn't until I got home later that I thought, I think I should be offended, because I had a tremor in my hand, and I didn't know what that was from. So I said to him, he said, is there anything else I can help you with? I had an ear infection or something. I said, yeah, well, my hands tremor a bit. And he said to me, well, you need to stop drinking. I said, I drink water after supper. Should I stop doing that? He goes, you just need to stop drinking. And it wasn't until I got home. He thinks I'm a boozer. On the other hand, your Uncle Bill, who passed away in November, he never recovered from his triple bypass. His doctor was my doctor. And he would drive to Uncle Bill's house on the territory at least once a week to check on him. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's really weird. He insulted me, but then he's going out of his way to help my brother. Yeah. So I forgave him. But I've been to him a lot of times since then. And I just put it down to him being very young and not having much contact with Native people.
That's an important part to me. That point right there is kind of important. And it's come up, I'd say, in my studies with regards to understanding those communities better is having interactions with people in those communities. Like, get out and know people, get out and meet people.
So I think that's what he was doing when he was coming onto the territory and visiting and taking his little medical bag and checking his heart and all that kind of thing.
That creates trust.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Again, I think it's all got to do with relationships. I mean, being Ungwehwe, being Indigenous, it's all about relationality and about relationships. So I would say I have had positive experiences, but it's also been because of the relationships I've built with my healthcare professionals, right? And part of our relationship has been me educating them sometimes, right?
That's a piece.
Like when my youngest son was born, but that was a very complicated pregnancy. Okay. He was a twin and his brother passed away at 26 weeks, but they were identical twins. So I had to carry them both to term. So, and I was older. I was 39 when I was pregnant with Tewanage, and I have diabetes. So that was another complication. I'm quite overweight. So that was another complication. I was a high risk pregnancy. For sure. So I had like a whole team. I had a specialist at the hospital and a whole team of people who were taking care of me. But my doctor was amazing. My primary doctor specialist was amazing. And things like I have cultural protocols that are important to me in childbirth. Like I wanted no one to speak once he was being born until my sister could speak to him in the language. I wanted I wanted to know that we would get the placenta back because we needed that for ceremony. And they respected all of that and they made sure that it happened. It was funny after because one of the nurses told me after that Dr. Davies, who was my doctor, was outside of I had to have a cesarean, so I was in the operating room. He was outside the operating room walking up and down in the hallway saying, Sego onwira, Sego onwira, because he had said, how do you say hello, baby? And I said, Sego onwira. So he's walking back and forth practicing it, right? Isn't that awesome? So that's one experience, right? I've had another experience that was not good. A young man from our community passed away at the hospital and he was part of the Longhouse, his very strong Longhouse family. And so there's protocols that we have around death. And the family had a really hard time because the hospital gave them a hard time about the things that we had to do, right? Because we had to have one of our speakers come right away. There's words that have to be said immediately when someone dies, and certain people have to be there and all these things, right? And the hospital didn't understand. So we got through that. But after that was all over, I had the hospital administrator called me and said, I understand that this was not a really great experience for that family. I want to know if you can tell us who can we talk to or what kind of training can we put in place to be better at how we relate to the people from Tyendinaga, because the hospital's right beside the reserve. So it's right where everybody goes. Mm-hmm. So they undertook things like cultural safety training and Kairos blanket exercise and did all those things, right? I've gotten out of the healthcare system what I've put into it. Because if you talk to my son, he'll tell you a really different story. He's got horrendous stories about his involvement with the healthcare system. But I mean, well, I'm older, I'm a little calmer than he is, and I'm used to living in this world with these people. So I've gotten out of it what I've put into it, I'd say. And I deal with those things now at a different level, because now that I'm here at the university, I work with the Faculty of Health Sciences and I work with the School of Medicine. And so the School of Nursing is over there, and rehabilitation therapy and all those things. And we've done things like developed modules for training. We've developed all kinds of resources for students who are going through the Faculty of Health Sciences and going into the health professions now. So now I'm working and facilitating change at this level because I work here, right?
I have had a number of experiences myself, like just as a nurse and trying to explain something to a coworker about why, for example, a mom doesn't want us coming in every time her baby cries. She starts like shushing her baby because she doesn't want to draw attention to herself. She doesn't want somebody to take her baby away. And I said, listen, this is what minority stress is. There's kind of like a baseline of anxiety around systems like this. I mean, this isn't this woman's home, and we're walking into her space every 5 minutes. So there's, conversations that need to happen between, coworkers and also between, patients and nurses, and those things take time.
I mean, for a million years, Indigenous people, even in Indigenous communities, wouldn't even participate in the census because they did not trust government with their information. So there are so many Indigenous people who've had horrible, horrible medical and health disasters. Even those who survived residential schools, they were tested on, Olivia. Those kids were tested. They were experiments, right? So there's a lot right away. There's a lot of mistrust,
right?
So that you're also dealing with that. Like, you're right. It's a beautiful hospital and it's this and that, but because of racism, because of the way they've already been treated, it's hard for them to trust. Right? That's why I say, like, the minute that you can understand what colonization has done to Indigenous peoples in Canada and see how their lives were forever changed and continue to be, that in itself will paint a clear picture of what needs to happen for reconciliation and what needs to take place for changes in healthcare for Indigenous people. Understand what those calls to action, read them. Read those 94 calls to action. Read them. And because they were created by Indigenous knowledge holders, traditional and scholars. And they did the difficult task of interviewing Indigenous people across Canada, of Indigenous people telling them, finally, somebody's going to listen to us. This is what we recommend for not only reconciliation, but I mean, just a basic human right for Indigenous people in Canada. So we need to be put on the same level playing field. And education, for example, healthcare, for example, is the worst in isolated communities because of the Indian Act, and that was about assimilation or just eliminating Indigenous peoples. If you understand the protocols of how to approach Indigenous people, if you read those 94 calls to action, if you equip yourself by self-learning first, but there are still some things that you want to know from Indigenous people, at least if you come to them already understanding who they are, what territory they come from, kind of what is the demographics of their community. Indigenous people will feel like they can tell you things if they feel that they're being respected, and if they feel that somebody cares about me, so I matter. They're trying to find out the whole story. They're not rushing me in like a drive-through. And I know nurses don't have a lot of time to do like in a regular wonderful world, right, Olivia? Like, you just don't have the time. But
have the time in school. When you're in school and you're learning about other people's paths, you have the time and you have the responsibility to understand and to seek out that knowledge. And I feel like there's something happening. And I wonder if it's just not being provided, or learners aren't being exposed to more communities.
Well, as long as anybody comes in and you're going to talk to them, there has to be a level of respect. Okay. And just say, I'm going to give you the time to tell me what is wrong. Medical jargon is really, really intimidating. And then when you don't understand what somebody's telling you, you start to feel stupid. And then you're going to shut down. And then you're just going to say yes to everything and leave. Not really feeling like you could ask the questions that you wanted to ask. Not feeling that you really mattered.
Listen, be respectful. I know a lot of times doctors especially will talk to you and then not wait for you to answer or to reply or comment on things they said, because they're so busy. They've got 40 patients to get through. They only give you this much time.
I think they need to be open-minded, and I think they need to listen, just what you said, right? Yeah. The ones who know best what we need is us, right? Yeah. And if you're walking into a room with people from underserved communities or, equity deserving groups, then you talk to them about what their needs are, right? You don't go in there telling them what they need. And I think it's really important. Relationship building is really important. And I know it's difficult in the role you play because you're not there all day, every day. You got a shift and you got a whole roster full of patients to look after.
It's a long shift though.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes people are there for a long time under your care, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to foster better relationships with them. Is going to help them in their healing process or their healing journey, or they might not even be able to heal. It'll be helping them move along wherever they're at. But I think it's important for people to feel respected and seen and heard, right? 1,000 cups of tea. I've been told it takes 1,000 cups of tea to develop a relationship. We tell researchers that all the time. You're going to go into an Indigenous community and do research. You have to build those relationships or you're not going to get anywhere. It takes 1,000 cups of tea. Sometimes people have to experience things, but sometimes they can get it through a story. But that's why I like the Kairos blanket exercise. Have you ever done the Kairos blanket exercise?
No.
The blanket exercise is this exercise where you lay out all these blankets on the floor and they represent North America. And the narrator tells the story of Indigenous people in land in Canada. So the story is told about pre-contact, contact, the effects of disease, the residential school, the 60s school, the treaty making. And through the story, blankets get taken away as the lands are removed from Indigenous people's authority. People are removed from the blankets as the children are taken away, as disease is taken away. And so you begin with this huge blanket and all these people. And at the end of the exercise, there's these little patches of blankets that are left with a couple of people. But it's visceral. You experience it. And people never walk away from that the same. It's a really important part of the exercise is the debrief after. There's a talking circle after where people talk about what they learned, what they experienced, how they felt, and how this is going to affect them going forward in their lives. Something like that, I think, is necessary for everybody who wants to work with and understand Indigenous people and our realities in this world.
Yeah.
Even the story about like land claims. I've had somebody tell me about the time they told a story about, think about your home, your house, your home, how important that is to you. And one day somebody comes to your home and you invite them to come in because they have nowhere to stay. And they come in and they stay with you. And as time progresses, they end up taking over your house, you know, and then all of a sudden they kick you out and they have your house and there you are with nothing. That's how we feel about our land, right? And we have connection to the land because our creation story talks about the fact that we come from the land. We have nowhere to go back to. We only have this land. That's why this is so important. That's why our land here is so important to us. And our ancestors are buried in it. Our histories here, our memories are here. We're tied to the land, right?
Offer the course in the home community with an Indigenous instructor. That would be offer some kind of healthcare. I don't know, like this. I was just thinking of this would entice some people in a healthcare, transportation, throw in some snacks. Or if you have to have a non-Indigenous instructor, get one who's sensitive, who can read up on it, who can talk to the people before they actually start delivering the program. Be just sensitive to the cultural differences. Just because somebody doesn't talk in class or raise their hand up doesn't mean they're not listening and paying attention. Doesn't mean they're not smart. It just means that they're watching, they're listening. And if they need to know something or clarify something, they will. I have found through many courses I've been to that the Native people don't like to raise their hand. Like we don't like to go like this. Like it's like it's being rude. Like put your hand down. You don't wave at me, kind of thing. You know.
So you would say that to increase nurses, for example, or doctors, like Indigenous nurses or doctors, is to do it on home or community land, have it
or near to. Yeah, sometimes it's not feasible. Like, oh, I got to build a new building for it. Like, but if there's like a place that they like at a community college that's near where they live, like it wouldn't take them like 2 hours to get to, kind of thing. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've always felt that the way I teach my class is kind of like a multi-modality learning, like tactile, like touching and seeing and doing, and not just sitting and taking notes. Especially Native people, I don't know how you stop them, because when you put a bunch of Native people together, they're just going to yap, 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 yap. And you have to let them do that.
So in a way, that's like a systemic change. I think maybe we could use that. It's literally a different way of learning. It's a different way of...
Well, if you're an instructor, you need to tell a few jokes and you need to put people at ease. You need to be not suit and tie kind of thing. You need to be comfortable. And when they see you're comfortable and you have a comfortable, casual way of teaching people, they'll learn. And make sure there's food if you have to sit.
Whatever.
But you can have
There's no food.
There's got to be
food.
I'm telling you, the courses that I've taken, even through being a teacher, when there's food, you'll learn a lot better. I don't know what that is, but you learn. If you've got a cup of coffee and you got a cookie, it's all good. You're feeling, it's what it is you're creating an air of comfort. I took this, I started to take a master's program in education. I'd drive 3 hours and sit all stuffy and nobody was eating. And I'm thinking, I sat there for 3 hours and I didn't talk.
Not quite.
I didn't learn anything. So I didn't go back. It wasn't for me. I took a first aid course on the territory where I was living, and there was snacks, there was drinking, we were laughing, and I learned more from that course than anything else.
I think there's something to be said, I guess, for different ways of needing to learn. Like if you're trying to focus on a particular community and you want to pull them in, you want to spark interest, you have to understand it's linguistics. You have to understand the same.
You have to know what's acceptable, not acceptable, and give good feedback.
How might you give feedback?
I was just going to give you an example. I took a reading specialist English as a second language. That was my specialist, because we had a lot of people coming from northern communities who didn't necessarily speak English, and I needed to know how to reach these people. This lady who was an Indigenous teacher, and she didn't talk much, but she gave us lots to read, gave us lots of things to think about, and she had food, and she would put a sticker on everybody's page, whether you passed or failed, everybody got a sticker on. Like, we were grown adults who'd been teaching for 5-10 years, and she put a sticker on everything, and she said, it's a small thing, but it makes people smile.
If nursing programs could work closely with Indigenous health organizations, Indigenous communities, and get a better sense of like the barriers and the needs and concerns of Indigenous people regarding healthcare, I think that might, and of course there's the need for Indigenous nurse role models. Right. So first of all, the nursing profession has to be seen as a really good job. And second of all, Indigenous people who want to become nurses more probably are doing it because they want to help their community do better, and they want to be there in their community.
I didn't think about that.
So I think the nursing programs should have maybe more Indigenous instructors. I don't know. I seem to be drawn to programs that kind of speak to me and to my life, right? So if nursing programs could have that kind of component, that would also send a message to Indigenous people that, they're serious about this.
Well, I would say, we have a faculty of health sciences here. We have a school of medicine and a school of nursing, and we have these conversations. So, and some of the things we've talked about is the need for indigenized curriculum. There needs to be, Indigenous students go where they see themselves represented. So they need to be included in the curriculum. They need to be included in the faculty. There needs to be more Indigenous faculty. There needs to be more Indigenous curriculum. I think there needs to be an emphasis within recruitment strategies to try and encourage Indigenous students to come here. But in order to do that, we have to make it a welcoming environment for them. Sometimes I think there has to be like scholarships and bursaries, because not a lot of Indigenous students can't afford medical school or to go to nursing school or any of that, right? Because it's a really high cost profession to get into.
There needs to be more.
Yeah. And that's the situation here too. And it was the students, it's largely the students who are making things happen, and it can't be that way. It needs to be part of the program.
I'm just wondering, what other doors can we open?
Yeah. Well, that's another thing we talk about here, is having adequate supports. And that might be social, psychological, spiritual, mentors, whatever, academic supports. So you have Indigenous nurses be the ones that are doing the recruiting, right? Or they're the role models.
Yeah, I like
role
that.
models and mentors. So they need to be included in the curriculum.
The money angle is definitely important, but it does take effort. You have to look, and you have to write the things. You have to give something of yourself. I have to say, as somebody who's applied for scholarships and all the things, it doesn't necessarily feel good. Like, it doesn't, I wish that there was another way to do it, that aspect.
One more thing.
Do tell.
The best instructors I've ever had would always tell us stories. It doesn't have to be long, drawn-out stories, just personal stories.
Okay.
Because that is really important, too, to know what their background is like.
Yes.
I've always been interested in what people say.
Everything about us is story. Our whole way of understanding it comes from story. Like, we begin with our creation story, our Thanksgiving address, the story of the Great Law. All these things form the cosmos of being Ungwehue. They're who we are, where we come from, how we came to be. And it teaches us how we need to be going forward. Like, these things are important. If I want to know who I am and where I come from, I need to know those stories. I need to understand those stories. My mantra here for a long, long time was Queen's University graduates leaders, policymakers, and decision makers. If we send graduate students out of here with no knowledge of Indigenous people and our reality in this country and our shared relationship and our history, then we're doing them a disservice. And I think storytelling is a way that we learn those things.
I think try to find time to listen to what people are saying, and that Canada hasn't been fully truthful or honest about why they did the things they did. And as a matter of fact, they didn't even want you to know. They didn't even want the general Canadian public to know. If you understand that, then you understand why there's more Indigenous people incarcerated than anybody else, 3 or 4 times the average. Why Indigenous people are, find themselves in serious substance abuse issues. Why their families are dysfunctional is they've had to do the best they had with the tools that they got.
Yeah.
And they learned some bad habits. You know what? If you can understand intergenerational trauma, that says a lot for the medical community, I think. Can I do anything about it right here when I see it for 10 minutes? No. But what I can do is find out if there's an Indigenous organization, and there probably is, that deals with specific care for what this individual may need, right? It's okay that you don't know all the answers. It's okay that you don't know every single thing about Indigenous people. But if you make an effort to research that, I just think that just make you a better person, willing to understand all cultures, willing to understand all people. You are going to have Indigenous people who are going to be intimidated and who aren't probably going to understand what you're saying, and who are going to need just a little bit of extra time. Let them tell their story. But if you're new jumping into this, understand, have an idea of what colonization did to Indigenous peoples. Start there, right? You don't have to know every little detail, but understand that, then that'll bring you up to why things are happening or not happening for Indigenous people today.
We are storytellers. We didn't have written language for many, many years. In the wintertime, parents are out hunting and the women are out doing what they do. So the grandparents were left in the longhouse with the children. And grandparents were supposed to, at that time, teach them their manners, their culture, their language, their ceremonies. But they did it through storytelling. So the storytellers would tell stories, but they wouldn't say, now, what did you learn from this story? It was up to the kids to decide what they wanted to take away from the story. The stories explained science, like thunder and lightning, why the birds flew south and why the bear has a short tail, those kinds of stories and legends. They did to explain the way things were done, like why we plant corn, beans, and squash in piles. Like there's all kinds of stories you can tell. And you never ever say, well, the moral of the story is this. It's up to the kids and what age they are. Like they'll hear the same stories over and over again. But as they go older, they pick more meaning from it. And so I just love hearing stories.
I guess I essentially like the host stories acknowledge, this is the big thing. They acknowledged Indigenous peoples. It's an acknowledgement. You exist. So like we
exist and we know something.
And you know something, there's like a recognition, you're saving space. It's like an acknowledgement. That feels like so important to me. That's so key to me. So I just wonder, like, is that sharing or the interest, is that dialogue important?
Well, that's what you're talking about, Olivia, is reconciliation. That's what you're talking about. And reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and recognizing what the heck happened here. When people start to want to listen to Indigenous stories, that they're coming closer and closer to reconciliation, right?
There's so much to learn from our stories. Like we begin with our creation story, our Thanksgiving address, the story of the Great Law. All these things together form the cosmos of being Ungwehue. They're who we are, where we come from, how we came to be. If I want to know who I am and where I come from, I need to know those stories. I need to understand those stories. But those stories are so complex because they're full of symbolism too, And I was old before I started figuring that stuff out. Like I remember once having one of my friends who I hold up as a very knowledgeable person, talking to us one day about the creation story. And, in our creation story, there's that spot where the sky woman's falling from the sky and the birds come and they catch her, right? And he was talking about that piece. And he said, that teaches so much because it's also talking about birth. Those birds that are catching Sky Woman are like the hands of the midwife who's catching the babies, and her coming to earth is birthing the earth. But it's like there's so much to learn from our stories.
Like I sing a lot of Anishinaabe songs, and we've created songs of our own, which are only vocals. The spirit in which the song was created, it came from a good mind, came from a good heart. And so even though we don't speak a specific language, it is the respect for our instruments, and I have a couple drums, and it's how we can maybe, you're not talking English, so you can't send a message.
That's key.
Right? But what you can do is have a feeling.
Is there an understanding of Indigenous stories to the greater public?
I think they're absolutely important and valuable. If you think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it's all the stories of the survivors of those schools that's had the impact on this country that it has in the last 5 years, right? And it wasn't until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and and all of those stories being made public that the broader Canadian population, I think, truly understood a very small part of the impact of our history. Because up until this point, people didn't give a lot of credence to the things that we said. But starting from those stories, then you can begin to understand. It's part of the teaching. It's part of the building understanding and recognition. Because from that story, then you can extend it to the story of that individual and the effect that it had on their life going forward and their family and their children and their children. And people begin to understand the whole concept of generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, and how the things that happened in the residential schools are still impacting our lives because it's the fallout from it, right? Like I have a friend of mine, I can't remember, it was like he said to me, my granddaughter is the first generation in our family not to be directly affected by the residential school.
And I was thinking about, every day when I walk into work, we have there's a whole corner I work at a children's hospital. So there's a whole corner of shoes and boots, just very large. And it's been there since I got my job there. And every day I walk in and I see that. And
how does that make you feel?
Because
it would break my heart.
Every day.
Every day.
Every day. So, and there's something to be said for like re-inflicting trauma again and again and again, every shift, and my experience obviously is different than yours. And, at the same time, like, people need to know.
And it's like you say, people can read, they can watch shows, but until there has to be a personal connection for, I think, there to be understanding. And I think storytelling is sometimes a way to make that connection.